I'm happy to move now to Adi Duchin, Dr. Adi Duchin, who wrote her dissertation at the University of Haifa. And her dissertation is Memoirs as a Bridge Between the Generation, Holocaust Survivors' Writing Experience and Their Children and Grandchildren's Reading Experience. She's a certified bibliotherapist, and she teaches in the Vice Livnat International MA program in Holocaust Studies and also in our Department of Counseling and Human Development. And she has published some of her work, and today we will hear the part about the writing of the memoirs.
So thank you, Adas. Thanks, Adas. I'm gonna share my screen first. Okay, so first, is it okay? Can you see it? Okay. So just first to say that I'm very excited and feel privileged to talk here today with my dearest friends, Adas and Dana. It's always, I'm excited always to present along with you. So thank you for the opportunity. So today I'm going to talk about memories of child survivors of the Holocaust, processing and healing of trauma through writing. And I want to start just by a quote that one of the interviewees that I interviewed for my research said when I asked her about writing about her story. She said, "I never thought about writing until the children asked. I repressed. But when I started, the memories began to flow." So as just Dana said, and as I'm sure many of you know, healing from a traumatic event is in many cases related to one's ability to tell his or her story. And writing the story, not telling the story, writing the story, evokes the memory in many cases. And this is something that really I felt really interested in. And this is one of the reasons that I decided to look at Holocaust survivors who wrote their stories and published them as books, as memoirs, as Adas said. And because I was interested in the significance of writing and of writing about a traumatic event, and I'll get into it in a second. So in some cases, writing about the traumatic event initiates and opens both internal and external dialogues, and this is something that I will refer to as we'll go along. So in my research, I had 13 child survivors of the Holocaust who I interviewed. They were 3 to 16 years old during the war. And as you can see, there's a wide range. It's quite different to be 3 years old than to be 16 years old during the war. And I'll refer to that again in a minute. And after the war ended, many of these child survivors had the need for an adult who would mediate what happened to them and who will accompany them in the processing of the traumatic experiences. And for many of them, they didn't have such an adult because their parents perished during the war, or they were separated from the adults that they knew before the war. So they were alone in this process. They didn't really have this adult who can help them and who can mediate what happened. And they started what is called the survivor struggle. And it actually continued for many of the child survivors who came to Israel after the war, who immigrated to Israel after the war. And it met the climate in Israel in the early 50s and 60s, in which these survivors, these child survivors, were not encouraged to talk about what happened to them. They were actually told, in some cases, they were directly told, but they were also in many other indirect ways, were told that what happened in Europe belongs to Europe. That here in Israel, we're building a country, we're starting something new, and people here don't want to know, don't want to listen to what happened to them back there in Europe. So just a few words about telling the traumatic story in general. So many survivors of many traumas, not only the Holocaust, talk about their fear that nobody wants to know about what happened to them. Primo Levi, in his book, If This Is a Man, he says, we tell about our lives and nobody wants to listen. This actually created something that Dan Baon called in his book a double wall between survivors and their children. And in many families, survivors from their side, the parents, the survivors from their side, they felt that that maybe their children don't want to know about what happened to them. That maybe if they will tell their children what happened to them, they will harm their children. So they didn't want to tell them. And the children, the second generations from their side, felt that if they will ask their parents about what happened to them, about their stories, they will harm the parents because they will make them, they will have to remember, they will have to think about all the things that they went through. So the parents didn't tell and the children didn't ask. And this actually involves what is called a communication pattern that is called knowing, not knowing, that Hadass and Jacques Barber, they wrote about it in their book, in which the story is, on the one hand, is known. The children know, the second generation know that their parents are survivors. They can generally say what their parents have been through, in which, if they were in camps or which experience they had, but they don't know the story in details. They don't know it as a whole. So they know the story, but they also don't know the story. And this communication pattern is really, I think, unique for families of Holocaust survivors. And I think that it reflects something about the trauma. And if I'm thinking about what you just said, Dana, so about maybe this lacuna that it exists even if you talk. So I think this is the way that it is being reflected inside the family. So we can ask why writing. As I said, I was interested in Holocaust survivors that wrote their stories. So we can ask why writing? Why do many survivors, and as I will say in a minute, it's actually quite wide. Many Holocaust survivors decide to write their stories, decide to publish it as books. They don't just write it to themselves. They take all the energy and all the effort and they publish it. They feel that they want people to read. And we can ask why writing? What are the benefits of writing? And the one thing that refers to what I just said is that writing about the story doesn't require an actual audience as listeners. It frees the writer from the immediate reactions of others. This fear that nobody wants to know, that nobody wants to listen, it actually, you don't have to deal with it when you write, because you're writing to yourself, you're writing to the page, you're writing to the computer. You're not, you don't have to think about what others will say right now. So this is the one thing that really, characterize writing. And also there's a lot of research about the benefits of expressive writing in both its physical and emotional aspects. The physical aspects, it involves, there's a lot of research in which you take the blood pressure or the heart rate of survivors from many kinds of traumas, and then you ask them to write about, just to freely write about their traumas, and then you measure it again, and you can see that it gets better after writing. And also, if we think about the emotional aspect, so many survivors report that they feel better after writing, that they feel relieved after they wrote about what happened to them. Also, there's the aspect of commemoration and the declaration of the victory of life over death. Because if you write something, you declare, now I'm here, I made it, I'm here, so life got over death. And also it's something that you can transmit to future generations. It's if the story is written, so you can really, actually, you can take it and you can bring it to your children, to your grandchildren, and you know that it won't be lost because it exists. It's now written. It's like, it can be, you can move it on. So this is just someone that wrote, just a survivor that of course didn't participate in my research, because otherwise I wouldn't show her picture. She wrote a book that is called The Candle in My Heart in 2011. She shares in her book her story of the Holocaust. You can see in the front, she has her picture as a child, as an adolescent. And this is just to say that it's quite common that many Holocaust survivors write their stories. And when I started my research, I was really interested in the question, why? Okay, I can see there's this wide phenomenon, many write, and I wanted to ask why and what do they benefit from it. And as I will refer in a minute, I also, as my research continued, I also thought about maybe what if they have costs for doing that, for writing about their stories, but I'll refer to that as we go on. So the methodology of my research is, as I said, I interviewed 13 child survivors, writers. They all wrote books, 7 men and 6 women. Their ages range from 77 to 90 during the interview. They all wrote their memories, their books themselves. They didn't use any ghostwriters or other people helping them writing. It was really, I thought that if I want to research the therapeutic aspects of writing, and so I need to interview the survivors that wrote themselves. Their writing was not mediated by others. They all published their stories. They didn't just write it to the drawer and left it there. They took the energy and in many cases a lot of money in order to publish their books and to publish their stories and to have them as books. I also interviewed 1 second generation and 1 third generation from each family about their readings, about how they felt when they read the story. I won't refer to these interviews here today, but I have another part of my research actually involves the way that the story is transmitted inside the family and the significance of it as a familial story. It's something that goes on from one generation to the other. And I also, I had a part that talks about the common themes for the second generation and the common themes for the third generation. But today I won't be talking about that. I'll only refer to the part that really involves the survivors. All the interviewees were interviewed by me in semi-structured interviews. The average length of an interview was 90 minutes, an hour and a half. So just to say something about the study design. So in the base of the research, there are the 13 books, okay? And the 13 survivors that wrote these books. Then I also interviewed 12 second generation, the sons or the daughters of these 13 survivors. And I interviewed 14 third generation, the grandchildren of these survivors writers. And altogether I had 39 interviews in my research. In order to analyze the interviews, I used qualitative analysis. The main principle or the main thing that I try to do is to remain as close to the data as I can, as close to the words that the interviewees chose to use. I also used 2 parallel processes. The first is I had an in-depth bottom-up analysis. I used line by line coding. In this way, I identified the meanings that the participants made of their experience. As I said, I tried to stay as close to the meanings that they gave to their words and not to the meanings that I give to their words. This is something really important to understand in qualitative analysis in general, but also in my research, I tried to use their meanings. And I also examined the codes for patterns, and I organized the data around central themes that I will present here in a minute. So actually 3 steps, I used 3 steps in my analysis. The first is the holistic analysis. Each interview was addressed as an independent text. I analyzed each interview as in itself. Then I did the categorical analysis. I identified and formulated the main themes in each interview. And then I did the cross analysis, the common themes across the interviews. And as I said, I did it twice. I did it for the first time, I did it for the survivors, and this I will present here today, and for the second generation and for the third generation, for each generation separately. And then I did it again for each family. I had 13 analyses all over again because I wanted to see the way that the story is transmitted inside the family. So today I'm going to talk about the main themes of the survivors generation. And this is, I'll refer to that in a minute. I'll just present it shortly. I actually identified three main dialectics in my analysis in the words, in the interviews of the survivors. The first I called the wordless space and self-narration. And here I had 4 categories: the birth of the story, the encounter with the hidden child, separation and loss, and recognition and validation. I will demonstrate this dialectic through the words of one survivor in a minute. The second dialectic that I identified was the aloneness and loneliness and the quest for connectedness. And when I say dialectic, what I mean, and maybe I should emphasize that, is that there is a tension between two things that actually emerge and grow together. I think maybe this is this is one of the ways to explain what a dialectic is. So I found it that many survivors, if I refer to the second dialectic, they felt alone and lonely, and at the same time, they had a quest for connectedness that was, they gave words to it through their writing and through the significance that they gave to their writings. And here I identified also a few categories: the wish for understanding, the wish for repairing relationships. Many of them, as I will demonstrate in a minute, wrote their stories with the quest that through their writing and through the books, maybe things that were really hard with their children and in their parenthood will be repaired. Also, another category was that the book and its writing served as a bridge between silence and telling. This was the way for many survivors to start telling after many years of not telling, or after many years of telling just brief aspects of the story and not telling the story as a whole, if, as I said about the knowing, not knowing. So here, this was the way to make the story known, to take the knowing side of the pattern. And when I looked at the wish for repairing the relationships, so I identified that for some of the survivors that I interviewed, this was fulfilled in part. For some of them, they felt that the disappointment was really the strong feeling that they had from their family, from the reactions of their family members or from friends. And the third dialectic is personal space and public space. And here there was the wish or the motivation for commemoration through writing, and the feeling that writing made the public documentation of the story possible. So I want to demonstrate these three dialectics through the story of three survivors writers. The first is Leah. It's of course not her name, it's the name that I chose. So Leah was born in 1936 in Poland. When she was 3 years old, her mother hid her in a basement and told her not to cry. She was alone in the basement for 3 days until her aunt came and took her. During the war, she escaped with her aunt under a false identity. And after the war, she immigrated to Israel and was educated in a kibbutz, like many Holocaust survivors. She got married, she studied, she had a career in Israel. She started a family, and she has 4 children and 16 grandchildren. So I want to demonstrate the first dialectic, which I called wordless space and self-narration, through a quote from Leah. So she says, she says in her interview, "Everybody keeps telling me how lucky I am that I was little and I don't remember. The message was that people should not talk, so people would not feel we're miserable. The writing is to help myself cope. I have always felt that if I write something down, I give it a structure and a framework. It contains it instead of having it running wild and doing whatever it pleases. It is expressed and it becomes more real and coherent." So here, I think that Leah's words really demonstrate this transmission or this quest for transmission from the space in herself that is wordless, that she can't give words to something that is more close to self-narration and creating a narrative from what happened to her, creating a story. So she's saying, if I write it down, it's not wild anymore. It's not something that I can express. It becomes structured. It has a framework. It's more contained. So this is, I think, one of the things that I saw in many of the stories of the survivors that I interviewed, that through writing they could do maybe a partial transmission or maybe a very significant transmission from this sense that it's wordless, that it can't be expressed, that it can be spoken about, that it can be to something that has a narrative, that has maybe the beginning and a middle and an end, and is more coherent and more whole. I want to demonstrate the second dialectic through a survivor that I chose to call Shaul. So Shaul was born in 1933. He survived in the ghetto after he was separated from his mother. He later escaped and wandered alone for several years in the forests and all over Europe. Actually, he immigrated to Israel. He has 3 children, 8 grandchildren. He retired from his academic career 10 years before I interviewed him. So Shaul says, I thought they would be more interested. He talks about his children. I thought that they would be more interested. My son was very interested in what I wrote and in the publishing process, but my daughters were not. He has 2 daughters and 1 son, especially the older one. She deliberately avoided the book and everything around it. I was angry at her, but I understood that I should keep silent. I didn't want to harm the relationship. So here we can see that through the book and through its writing, Shaul felt that he expressed a quest. He expressed his wish that maybe through the book and through its writing process and reading process of his children, maybe maybe they will connect better, maybe they will be more close, maybe he will be more understood about things that he felt and about maybe his parenthood. And other survivors in my research expressed that. And he's saying he felt angry on his daughter, that she doesn't want to read the book, that she avoids the book and and its reading and its publishing process. But he also felt that he shouldn't say anything because he didn't want to harm it. He didn't want to make it worse, as he told me in another part of the interview. So through writing, he expressed something that he wished for a repair maybe in the relationship, that maybe something that is broken will now be better. And he felt disappointed that he couldn't achieve it through writing, that he was left alone as maybe he was before he started to write. The third dialectic I will demonstrate through Sarah's story. So Sarah was born in 1931 in Poland. She hid alone during the war. After the war ended, she discovered that her whole family had perished. She immigrated to Israel alone, got married, has 3 children, 9 grandchildren. When she retired she had a very impressive career, and she retired from it. Then she started to collect documents regarding her family and documents that are connected to the place that she lived in Poland, to her village and to the people in her it's a small town. And she decided to write her and their story. She says that her decision to write is not only hers. She's not writing only her story. She's writing the story of all her family and all the people that lived in the place that she lived. This is the way she refers to her book. And she says, it was important to me for the book not to contain only the stories that I remember, but also documents and testimonies of people who came from my town. So I went and I interviewed them. It also enabled my children to look at my book differently. So she said in her interview that she felt that if she will include in her book all the documents and all the testimonies, it will have more historical value. The book will be valid. It will be more valid because it has all these documents in it, and then maybe her children will read it with more respect, or they will believe her. Her story will be more valid. And this is also something that I saw in many of the stories of the survivors that I interviewed, that they felt that people will not believe them. They said, I don't know if my children or other people will believe what I wrote. I don't know. Many of them, they were children. They don't have evidence to what happened to them. They don't have other people saying, yeah, that's true. You were there and you were there and you were there. You know, children, when they develop normally, so lots of the validation that they get is from the adults around them. And these children, they didn't have that. So they felt that, so Sarah is saying very strongly that if I will include, she went and she interviewed a lot of people from the town that she came from. And she had a research, she went to Europe to look for documents. And it was all for her children to believe what she's writing, that her story is real, that it really happened. I want to end my presentation today by saying a few words about, as I said in the beginning, about the benefits and the costs of expressive writing. And I'll begin with the benefits. And I think that writing actually enabled many of the survivors that I interviewed to start or to participate in an internal and also an external dialogue. They started a dialogue with themselves about what happened to them, about, you know, I remember one that said, I'm a survivor. When I wrote it down, I understood for the first time that I'm a survivor, that I'm a child survivor, that I belong to that group. And also for others, it started a dialogue with their children, a different dialogue maybe from the one that they had before. As I said, it's quite complicated because it's not, for some of them, they wished for a dialogue, but they didn't get the dialogue that they wanted. But I think that that many of them benefit from starting something that they were not able to do without the writing. But also, as I saw in my research, and I was quite surprised, if to be honest, is about the costs of expressive writing. And about, I actually identified the overflow of memories, actually when there was not, the survivors didn't engage in a psychotherapy process, or they didn't have an adult who would mediate to them what is happening to them as they were back there in Europe when they were children. So in these cases, the overflow was in some cases too much. So it was, you know, writing didn't only give them something, it was also very difficult. It was also something that, you know, that I think that they would benefit more if they had the professional guidance and the professional help alongside with their writing. So I just want to end with this picture, which I really like, because you can see the survivors in the middle, and the second generation, and third generation, and the fourth generation. And I think that I find it really moving, this picture, and also to say something about the commemoration and about I think this is the best picture if we are talking about the victory of life over death. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adi. And this raises a lot of interesting issues also in relation to our first lecture, the first panel, and also in relation to Dana and the idea of meaning making. Where does meaning go in this? And one wonders if Pinchas, I don't know, they mentioned he had a memoir, so one wonders, how did he write about Sabina, his sister,
yeah,
his sweet sister, in the memoir? And yeah,